Hello, church, and welcome to our virtual worship service for Sunday, June 28th, 2020. This week, we're kind of approaching Independence Day, July 4th on Saturday, so I've kind of been in that zone of reflecting on freedom and what our truest sense of freedom looks like, what it means. A lot of us have had an ample opportunity to reflect on those freedoms or various types of freedoms in our lives over these past few months. So I hope that this begins a reflection or process of thinking for each one of us that can lead us into a really meaningful experience this year of this important holiday in our country. As we always do at the beginning of our service, I'd like to welcome you into a spirit of prayer. And I will begin with some of the prayers that I've received this week from email or text. The first prayer I'd like to lift up is for Vicky Elmgren's brother, John. John is facing some upcoming surgery for a growth on his kidney. And I don't know what it is yet, but at this point, we're praying for his health and well-being, especially since today we just did find out that he has been admitted to the emergency room. So as he's preparing for the surgery, may he know the hands of care through his doctor. May he know the love of friends and family. May he know the heart of God. And may it all give him the strength that he needs to face what is to come for him. So we hold John in prayer this morning. Our prayers are also lifted today for some friends of this congregation for whom we have prayed before, Rick and Kathy Bennett. Rick has received a bone marrow transplant in Stanford and is on a difficult path right now toward recovery. So we hold him in prayer. And we continue to hold his wife, Kathy, in our prayers as well, who has been on a long journey with cancer and continues to receive treatment. We pray that good news will come their way and for the strength and the peace to meet the requirements of each day. Today we lift up our UCC mission co-worker. His name is Eleazar Fernandez. He's the president and academic dean of Union Theological Seminary in the Philippines. We pray for the work that he and that whole seminary is doing as they train new leaders for the modern church, and also in their efforts to make a difference in the lives of the most poor and vulnerable in that nation. We thank God for the work that he has been doing there. We also continue to pray for our country as we continue to move through so many different things that seem to be happening every day. It seems something new. Be it the ongoing voicing of unrest and protest, the crying out for justice, or be it the pandemic that just seems to not really care much about how ready we are for it to go away. I suppose my prayer through these things is that we have the fortitude, the rootedness, the depth of character to really pay attention, to listen to the voices as they speak, the ones that cry out in pain, but also the ones that speak out trying to lead us in directions that will help. Help us to find that resolve within, not to just dismiss, not to succumb to frustration or anger or labeling or belittling, but to stay focused, stay rooted again in what's most important, what's essential, to help not only us as individuals, but as a community, as a nation, as a world, walk through these unprecedented times. We're going to hold a moment quiet prayer, you might just close your eyes, maybe speak aloud a name or a concern or a joy, or just hold it in your heart. But let's be in prayer for a moment together. Then I'll lead us in a pastoral prayer, and we'll say the Lord's Prayer together. God, how many times have we said in recent days that if we could just get a sense of clear direction, how we should proceed, what we need to do. And for so many of us, that just doesn't seem to happen. Maybe it happens here or there, but it's so hard to connect the dots. So what I ask today is that willingness for each of us to enter into that space of just listening, just being open to receiving something of your Spirit, something of your wisdom, something of your freedom. Not trying to figure it out. Trying to move too quickly toward all the answers, but really being in this, continuing to be in it. And I know, we're all frustrated. We all want things to change. We want movement. It's not always ours to decide. So in the midst of that occurrence, may your grace infuse us. May it move down through the soles of our feet to root us more deeply into the soil where we stand. Help us to connect to the depths of this world and of our own lives. That out of us might come fruitful harvest of words, reception, of receptivity, of openness. That each one of us might be like a wet sponge. Just pick up more of your wisdom, God, to help us move through these difficult days. We follow one who knows difficult days well. In the midst of so much turmoil, he shared these words, these ideas with those who followed him. That a prayer like this might keep them rooted in what was most important, in what they really needed to do and to be, no matter what the circumstances. So together, let us lift the words of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Would you please continue to be with me in the spirit of prayer? When we hold out our hands, only to be cuffed by loneliness, you are the one who clasps our wrists and pulls us into your heart. are shattered by all the darkness and the injustices that are done to those who are passed over by the world. Your love puts us back together so that we can serve all of them with your hope. So, emancipating God, we ask that you free us to love like you do. When we would build walls between us and our neighbors, you come to the welcome to be a welcoming gate. When we would curse someone, maybe someone that's hurt us deeply, you sing us songs of blessing. When we would focus only on our needs and what we got to have and our desires, you instead pick up the dinnerware and you ask us to set the table. God, who is ever near salvation, may we find and may we become new life today. And when we would feed on our bitter brokenness, you would offer us the bread of reconciliation. When we would grasp that cup of peace and we would drink it all for ourselves to the last drop, you would whisper, offer that. Offer it to someone that you don't even like. Liberating Spirit, free us from what binds us or holds us back and help us in all our days to be more like you. Amen. Our scripture today comes from Paul's letter to the Galatians. I'm going to be reading some excerpts from chapter 5, verses 1 and then 13 to 15. Paul writes, "For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another." May God bless this reading and our understanding of it. So have you ever noticed that freedom seems to be experienced most fully, or maybe in a sense you could say most freely, when we are at the end of something? Say when old responsibilities or worries or fears kind of have been cleared from the table. Maybe we're at this point of transition when we're preparing for something new. There's something about being at the end of something that allows freedom to shine through. Even in speaking to a couple people who are near the ends of their lives right now, this last week, there's this sense of freedom in the way they talk, both in the things that they say and then how they say them. There's a story from a couple years back about an Episcopalian priest who had fought cancer for a long time. And after many years of treatment, it had finally gone into remission. And he was so excited to get to enjoy his life again, to live and travel and suck the marrow out of life. But unfortunately, the remission only lasted a few months before his cancer returned, and this time with a vengeance. In fact, his oncologist leveled with him. He said, we might be able to extend your life a few weeks, maybe just a few days. You're probably going to have to make a decision. And the priest prayed and thought and then decided to forego care. He wanted to live the rest of his life and face death on his own terms. And then, in the midst of preparing for his death, he discovered something. He'd been set free to love in a way that he'd never seen before, he'd never had before.
He said to one of his colleagues, it's as if my mind and soul and body have been opened up to see love in ways that I never have before. And now all that matters is the love that was, the love that is, and the love that will be. And a few weeks later, he died. And in his funeral, one of his close friends said, in dying, he really was fully alive. There's something about being at the end that enabled him to experience life more fully, to give himself over to it more completely. Recently I was reminded of an event from 12 years ago, and it really does seem like a bygone era. But it was a simple speech that Senator John McCain delivered, and it happened to be on election night of 2008 when he conceded defeat to then Senator Barack Obama. And in that speech, at the end of this brutal campaign, right, Senator McCain said, "My friends, we've come to the end of a long journey. The American people have spoken. They have spoken clearly. A little while ago, I had the honor of calling Senator Barack Obama to congratulate him on being elected the next president of this country that we love." I mean, do you hear those words and the grace and the dignity that are in them? And the campaign was finally over, and in that moment, John McCain was finally free to speak from a different place. And sure, he could have chosen all sorts of different tacts, right? He could have chosen enmity, strife, anger, blaming, stoking fear, whatever. The kind of stuff we hear pretty much every day from our current leadership. But in that moment, in the moment of defeat, Senator McCain chose grace and love of country. And it was simple, and it was beautiful, and it was such powerful leadership. In the same way, so we have George Washington giving a farewell speech in September of 1796. He decides to do it totally differently. He doesn't give it in front of Congress or anything. He decides to publish it in a newspaper so that the public could read it. Now, it's pretty long, but if you do get to look at it, there's three primary concerns he talks about. And he's talking about hyperpartisanship, foreign wars, excessive debt. I know, does that sound familiar to anybody? Washington worked very hard on all these concerns, and he worked on many other issues too. But he wanted to communicate in that speech, just before leaving office for good, that he believed in the American people, that they had the heart and the courage to continue forward in the ways that mattered the most. So in our reading today that we heard, this letter to the Galatian church, Paul addresses the issue that they were having. Now, this is a church that in many ways was near its own end. And Paul even says, essentially, if you keep biting each other, eventually you will devour each other. Now, that's being harsh, I get it. But he's speaking freely near what he sees to be the end. It's almost the end point for them. He's like, stop it. You got to be mature adults here. If you keep this up, your church will most certainly die. And he tells them, hey, you've been made free by Jesus' life, by Jesus' teaching. So cut the nonsense and live like he showed you. And the issue in his church, though, was power and control. Now, I know. That sounds familiar to anyone? Not only in church, but pretty much in every conflict. There were many that had these old ideas about certain practices, and it was specifically circumcision. And they were using that issue as a means of controlling outsiders. They were trying to say, you got to be like us. If you want to be a part of us, you got to do what we do. And we're going to keep you on the margins of society if necessary until you do. But Paul challenges them and to see the others there not as foreign or as outsiders that had to do as they did and said, but instead they were all a part of God's family. And today, in our country, couldn't we all use a good dose of say, President Washington and his articulation of encouragement, or even John McCain and his grace and maturity? And we in church could also use a dose of Paul and his compassionate directness. And it's amazing how when you look at all these leaders, they're speaking to issues that continue to be a burden to us now. When Washington spoke against hyperpartisanship, he warned that it would lead to this. This is what he said. It would lead to a frightful despotism. It leads us away from true democracy to authoritarianism. From a sense of unity to divisions of us and them. It demonizes and marginalizes opponents, leaving no room for conversation or nuance or mutuality. Does that sound familiar to anyone? And hey, I need not be talking about our country. It's not just that. It's this kind of stuff happens in our families. It happens at school. It's in workplaces. It was happening in Paul's day, where the Galatian church was creating this whole group of others, this us and them mentality. There was no middle ground, no nuance, no conversation. And then Paul gets so frustrated that at one point, somewhere around chapter 3, he says, "You fools, do you not remember who you are? Do you not remember that there's no longer Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, because you're all one?" That's what he's been trying to tell them. And he's saying, we're all followers in this church. We're united in our freedom to love one another. Will there be disagreements and arguments? Of course. But all the tough conversations that we know are going to come up and that we should be having, they're going to be done with a mutual respect and dignity and love. That's what it's about. That's what Paul was insisting on. And so how do we do it? Oh, it's simple. And it begins by walking down this road that we call being real, being vulnerable, maybe committing ourselves to this walk we often call intimacy. It's our willingness to be vulnerable with the other, where we discover what's in common between us. And that's not only true in the way we should act in government, but it's relevant to every issue of conflict and concern, anything we face. So that class we started on white privilege, we watched this opening video that discussed racism and all these issues. And it was Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And she said something that was just so painful and real. And based on people's reactions in the room, it resonated with a lot of our experiences. She was talking about the ongoing problem of segregation in our society and how communities are so commonly divided along racial lines. And look, Auburn's no different. And she said, one of the hardest places of reflection for me was when I realized that I could live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I followed the trajectory that my loving parents, laid out for me, living in a good neighborhood, and by good she meant, mostly white. But she was saying I could live in my good neighborhood and go to my good school and my good college and get my good career where I would hopefully rise to the top. I could do all those good things and live my whole life and easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color. And not one person who ever guided me ever conveyed that there was a loss. Her honesty right there, that intimacy, that really struck a chord with a lot of us in the room. And there were a lot of heads nodding. A lot of us really heard what she said. And because it was so heart-led, so courageous, it helped all of us, I think, look a little deeper. To be courageous in the way we see our own lives and the trajectories that we have chosen. And more than that, it set a tone in which all of us could admit the times and the places where we'd blown it, where we'd messed up, avoided, or even hurt others out of insensitivity or ignorance, particularly in relation to people of color. And look, the point wasn't to create shame, but just to see more clearly, to name what's true, to learn to listen, and to value voices and experiences that we've not often been told, that have value. We haven't been shown them. And then at the end of the day, to make changes. Real courage gives us the power to admit when we're wrong, to alter our position, to grow. It allows us to stand up before the world in our full humanity and declare who we are really and how we really are. And even when times are difficult, maybe even when we find ourselves in deep disagreement with someone. I mean, what would happen in Washington, D.C. if our political leaders across the board could rediscover that kind of courage. I mean, think back, for those of you who are old enough, to that terrible time in our nation when President Reagan was nearly assassinated. And I'm sure many of you can remember that pretty clearly. One of the stories to emerge from that time was when President Reagan was wheeled into surgery. He still had the presence of mind to say to the surgeon, "Doctor, I sure hope you're a Republican." And the surgeon, who apparently was a well-known liberal Democrat, said right back, "Mr. President, today we're all Republicans." Why does it take near tragedy? Why does it take, or actual tragedy, before we recognize the things that bind us together? Before we can put the BS aside? I mean, think back to 9/11. We all thought that would change everything. Remember that time when George Bush stood up there in front of Congress and Tom Daschle, the liberal Democrat leader, just gave him a hug, almost without saying anything? Why does it take the worst to bring out our best? One more great story about Ronald Reagan from the same time period. So he's recovering from the surgery for his gunshot wound. Many people don't realize how close he was to not making it. And it was really touch and go for a while. But there was a point where they weren't letting a lot of people in either. But one of the people that they did let in was an old friend who he'd had a lot of jousting matches with. And it was Tip O'Neill, Thomas Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House during most of Reagan's presidency, his 2 terms. So they had all these disagreements, but they somehow had forged a close friendship. So Tip O'Neill goes into the room, and he gets on his knees, takes the president's hand, and together they said Psalm 23. And in a whisper, President Reagan said, "Thanks for coming, Tip. It's really good to see you." And then Tip O'Neill stood up and leaned over to kiss the president's forehead before he said goodbye. What was it that the Apostle Paul wrote to that angry, hostile church in Galatia? "For you were called to freedom. You were not called only to use your freedom to serve yourselves, but to be servants in love to one another." We have been set free to love one another. And all it takes is a little courage. Just a little something. And it's something that each one of us already has. Right here. Amen. Amen.
Good morning, church. When Pastor Dan told me about the topic this week of freedom, and a freedom that comes from recognizing the larger community and putting that community sometimes before our own personal needs, again, Jackson Browne came to mind. And he has a song that he put out on his newest album called Walls and Doors. I thought I'd share that with you this morning. Ever since the world's existed, there is one thing that's for certain. There are those who build walls and those who open doors. Oh, but this fine love, I'm thinking you already knew. For some it's always winter, while others have the spring. Some people find good fortune, while others never find a thing. Oh, but this, my love, is something you already knew. That's how it's always been, and I know you know it. this my love? It's something you already knew. At some point on the horizon, sky can be confused with earth. Some people dream of God, while others dream of wealth. But of course, my love, this is what you see out there on the streets. It's how it's always been, and I know you know it. There can be freedom only when nobody owns it. Let me say that again, because I know you know it. There can be freedom only when nobody owns it. When nobody owns it. When nobody owns it. Ever since the world's existed, there is one thing that's for certain. Some people build walls, and others open doors.
Thank you for joining us in our virtual worship service today. And as you prepare to go about the rest of your day and your week preparing perhaps for July 4th, I pray that we all can reflect on what it means in our own lives to be a people of open doors rather than building walls. May you all be held in the peace and the love and the grace of